A man adopts a homeless girl and takes her to work, thinking he's simply giving her a chance at a better life. But the moment she steps into the office, whispers ripple through the halls. Her curious wanderings lead to an accidental discovery that shakes the company to its core. She's not just any girl, she's the CEO's long-lost daughter. Secrets buried for years start unraveling, and questions arise. How did she end up homeless? What will happen when the truth collides with power? And will this unexpected connection mend hearts or destroy everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Nathaniel Miller hurried along the wet sidewalk. His worn dress shoes clicked against the concrete, matching the tired rhythm of his heart. Another exhausting day at the office had left him drained, his shoulders hunched under the weight of endless deadlines and his supervisor's constant criticism. The wind picked up, sending a shiver through his thin jacket. He'd been meaning to buy a warmer coat, but after paying his rent and utilities, there wasn't much left from his modest paycheck. The thought of his nearly empty bank account made his stomach clench. As he passed a row of shuttered storefronts, their metal gates pulled down like tired eyelids, something caught his attention. There, huddled against a brick wall, sat a small figure that made his heart skip a beat. A young girl, no more than 12, wrapped her arms tightly around her knees. Her backpack, torn at the seams and patched with duct tape, lay beside her like a faithful but wounded friend. Nathaniel slowed his pace, unable to look away. The girl's dark hair hung in tangles around her face, and her thin jacket seemed wholly inadequate against the bitter cold. She looked up briefly, meeting his gaze with eyes that held both wisdom and wariness beyond her years. His feet carried him a few steps past her before he stopped, his conscience tugging at him like an insistent child. A rundown corner deli stood nearby, its windows foggy and its neon open sign flickering weakly. Nathaniel reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the few crumpled bills he had left until payday. "Just enough for bus fare this week," he mumbled to himself. But the image of the girl's trembling shoulders wouldn't leave his mind. With a deep breath, he pushed open the deli's door, setting off a tired-sounding bell. The warm aroma of soup and fresh bread wrapped around him like a comforting embrace. Behind the counter, an elderly man waited patiently as Nathaniel studied the menu board, mental calculations running through his head. "One turkey sandwich," he said finally. "And a cup of your hot soup, please. The vegetable one." As the man prepared his order, Nathaniel watched through the window. The girl hadn't moved, except to pull her knees closer to her chest. The sight made his throat tight. Minutes later, paper bag in hand, he approached her carefully, not wanting to frighten her. "Excuse me," he said softly, keeping a respectful distance. "I thought you might be hungry." The girl looked up, her eyes darting between his face and the bag. She didn't speak, but her gaze held equal measures of hope and suspicion. "It's just a sandwich and some soup," he continued, his voice gentle. "Nothing fancy, but it's warm." After what felt like an eternity, she reached out with slightly trembling hands to accept the bag. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city noise. Nathaniel watched as she carefully opened the container of soup, letting the steam warm her face before taking a small sip. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if trying to make each bite last as long as possible. The city lights began to flicker on around them, casting a pale glow on the wet pavement. Nathaniel shifted his weight, concern growing in his chest. Is there someone looking after you?" he asked carefully. The girl, Veronica, though he didn't know her name yet, paused mid-bite. Her eyes clouded over, and she looked away, focusing intently on a crack in the sidewalk. The wind picked up again, and Nathaniel pulled his jacket tighter. The responsible thing would be to call someone to make sure she was safe. But something in her guarded posture told him she wasn't ready for that conversation. With a heavy heart, he turned toward home, each step feeling heavier than the last. The image of her sitting alone in the growing darkness haunted him, a reminder of all the broken things in the world he couldn't fix. The morning light crept reluctantly through Nathaniel's small apartment window, casting weak shadows across the stack of bills spread over his kitchen table. He sat there in his threadbare undershirt, a cold cup of coffee forgotten beside him as he sorted the envelopes into urgent and more urgent piles. Final notice glared at him in red letters from the electric bill. His rent was due in 3 days, and the number in his checkbook made his stomach twist. The radiator in the corner sputtered and clanked, as if reminding him it could give up any day now. Nathaniel rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the clock. 6:45 a.m. He couldn't afford to be late. Rising from the wobbly kitchen chair, he made his way to the bathroom, where the fluorescent light buzzed and flickered before finally staying on. The mirror showed dark circles under his eyes, and his clean but worn suit jacket hung on the back of the door, a thin patch forming at one elbow. He dressed carefully, smoothing down his tie and adjusting his collar. The suit might be old, but he could at least wear it with dignity. A quick check of his appearance, a futile attempt to tame his graying hair, and he was ready to face another day. The gleaming corporate tower where Nathaniel worked rose like a giant mirror against the morning sky, reflecting clouds and sunshine while casting long shadows over the smaller buildings around it. Inside, the marble lobby echoed with clicking heels and important conversations. Nathaniel's employee badge granted him access to the elevator, where he rode up to the 14th floor, squeezed between executives who never seemed to notice him. His desk sat in what felt like an forgotten alcove, tucked away from the main thoroughfare of office traffic. The carpet was slightly more worn here, the fluorescent lights a touch dimmer. Nathaniel settled into his chair, booting up his computer and organizing the stack of reports that needed reviewing. Around him, the office hummed with activity. Sharp-dressed employees hurried past his corner, their conversations a blur of deadlines and projections. Nobody stopped to say good morning. Nobody ever did. "I want those numbers recalculated by noon," a harsh voice cut through the usual office noise. Charles Barrington strode down the hallway, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his presence commanding attention. A young associate trailed behind him, clutching a tablet and looking terrified. "But sir, the data verification alone will take," the associate began. "Did I ask for excuses?" Barrington's voice dripped with contempt. "Noon. Or you can explain to HR why you're not meeting expectations." The associate scurried away, nearly dropping his tablet. Barrington continued his path through the office, stopping occasionally to bark orders or criticize someone's work. His presence left a wake of nervous energy and lowered heads. When lunch hour finally arrived, Nathaniel grabbed his simple sandwich and headed outside. The autumn air felt fresh after the sterile office environment, but his mind wasn't on his meal. His eyes scanned the nearby streets, looking for a familiar small figure with a patched backpack. The spot where he'd seen Veronica yesterday was empty now, just another patch of concrete in the vast city. He sat on a bench, barely tasting his sandwich as he wondered where she might have spent the night. Had she found somewhere warm? Was there anyone looking out for her? The weight of his own problems seemed to shift, making room for this new worry that had settled in his heart. The lunch hour slipped away too quickly, and Nathaniel found himself back at his desk, but his thoughts kept drifting to the young girl and the look in her eyes when she'd accepted his small kindness. The autumn evening had settled over the city, bringing with it a biting chill that made Nathaniel pull his thin jacket closer. Instead of heading straight home, he deliberately chose the longer route, his eyes scanning every shadowy corner and alley. The streetlights flickered to life one by one, casting pools of yellow light on the dampening sidewalks. His shoes clicked against the concrete as he walked block after block, hope diminishing with each empty corner. Then, near a closed convenience store with fading advertisements in its windows, he spotted her. Veronica sat huddled against the brick wall, her small frame almost hidden behind the torn backpack she clutched like a shield. Nathaniel's heart clenched at the sight. She looked even smaller than he remembered, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Veronica?" he called softly, staying a few steps away. "It's Nathaniel, from yesterday." She looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes, mixed with that same wariness he'd seen before. Her jacket seemed too thin for the cooling weather, and he noticed how she had tucked her hands into her sleeves for warmth. Nathaniel knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. The concrete was cold and hard through his work pants, but he barely noticed. "I've been worried about you," he said gently. "Do you have anywhere safe to stay?" Veronica shook her head slightly, her eyes dropping to the ground. "Can you tell me about your family?" he asked, keeping his voice soft and steady. "Is there someone I can call for you?" The silence stretched between them. Veronica's fingers tightened on her backpack straps, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My mom," she started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "She died 3 weeks ago." The words hung heavy in the evening air. Nathaniel felt them settle like a weight in his chest. "I'm so sorry," he said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "What about your father, or other relatives?" Veronica shook her head again, more firmly this time. "Never knew my dad. Mom said he left before I was born. And there's nobody else." Nathaniel took a careful breath. "Have you thought about talking to social services? They could help." Before he could finish, Veronica's head snapped up, fear clear in her eyes. "No." The force of her response surprised him. "Please, no. I can't go there. They'll put me in the system, and I'll just be—" She trailed off, but her meaning was clear in the way her shoulders hunched protectively. A hot chocolate vendor was closing up his cart nearby, the warm, sweet smell drifting over to them. Nathaniel stood up, his knees protesting the movement. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" he asked, offering a small comfort in the face of such overwhelming loss. Veronica hesitated, then nodded. Nathaniel quickly bought 2 cups before the vendor packed up completely. They moved to a nearby bench under a street lamp that cast uneven light over them. The warm cup seemed to thaw something in Veronica's demeanor. She took small, careful sips, her rigid posture relaxing slightly. Nathaniel watched her from the corner of his eye, his own cup forgotten in his hands. The thought of this child spending another night on the streets made his chest ache. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find a way to help her find proper care, even if it meant taking her to a caseworker's office himself. But for now, he simply sat with her, offering what comfort he could in the form of warm chocolate and quiet company. The first rays of morning light crept through Nathaniel's threadbare curtains, finding him already awake and sitting at his small kitchen table. He hadn't slept well, his mind churning with worry about Veronica. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten beside a half-eaten piece of toast as he wrestled with the decision weighing heavily on his conscience. The apartment felt especially empty this morning, its worn furniture and bare walls a testament to his modest means. He ran his hands through his disheveled hair, considering the risks. Taking in a minor without proper authorization could lead to serious legal trouble. He could lose his job, face criminal charges, or worse. But leaving her on the streets felt equally impossible. Nathaniel stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the city slowly coming to life below. The morning was crisp and clear, but he knew the autumn chill would be biting. His gaze drifted to the clock on the wall. 7:15 a.m. By midday, he promised himself she would at least be somewhere safe and warm. Having made his decision, he quickly dressed for work and headed outside. His heart lifted with both relief and concern when he spotted Veronica exactly where he'd left her the night before. She was curled up against the brick wall, her backpack serving as a makeshift pillow. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes looked even more rumpled than before. "Good morning, Veronica," he said softly, approaching with careful steps. She startled awake, relaxing slightly when she recognized him. "Hi," she mumbled, her voice rough from sleep. Nathaniel crouched down beside her. "Listen, I know you're scared of social services, and I understand, but you can't keep sleeping out here." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Would you come up to my apartment? Just for a warm meal and maybe some clean clothes. Then we can figure out what to do next." Veronica's eyes darted between his face and the building entrance, uncertainty clear in her expression. Finally, hunger and exhaustion won out over fear. She gave a small nod and slowly got to her feet. The walk to his apartment was silent. Veronica's footsteps were nearly silent behind him as they climbed the stairs, her body tense with each creaking floorboard. When they reached his door, she hesitated for a moment before following him inside. Nathaniel's apartment was small but neat, with sunlight streaming through the windows making it feel less cramped than it was. Veronica stood awkwardly near the door, taking in her surroundings with quick, nervous glances. "Make yourself comfortable," Nathaniel said, gesturing to the worn couch. "I'll get you something to eat, and maybe find you a clean sweater. Mine will be too big, but it's warm." He moved to his bedroom and returned with an old gray sweater, soft from years of washing. "The bathroom's through there if you want to change," he said, pointing to a door off the kitchen. While Veronica changed, Nathaniel prepared a bowl of oatmeal, adding a spoonful of brown sugar and some sliced banana, a rare treat he'd been saving for himself. When she emerged, swimming in his oversized sweater, she looked younger than ever. They sat at his small kitchen table, the morning light casting long shadows across the worn linoleum. Veronica ate slowly, methodically, while Nathaniel tried to broach the subject of social services again. "I know it's scary," he said gently, "but there are people whose job it is to help kids in situations like yours. I promise I'll stay with you through the whole process. We can go this afternoon. I'll make some calls and set up a proper meeting." Veronica stirred her oatmeal, not meeting his eyes. "You promise you won't just leave me there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise," Nathaniel replied firmly. "We'll face this together." The morning light had barely touched the city skyline when Nathaniel's phone rang. He answered quickly, not wanting to wake Veronica, who had fallen asleep on his couch. The caseworker's voice was apologetic but firm. They couldn't meet until noon. Nathaniel's stomach tightened as he looked at his watch. He couldn't miss work, but he couldn't leave Veronica alone either. The weather report had warned of bitter cold, and the thought of sending her back to the streets made his chest ache. After a moment of internal struggle, he gently shook Veronica awake. "There's been a small change of plans," he explained softly. "The caseworker can't meet us until later. Would you be okay coming to my office for just a few hours?" Veronica nodded sleepily, still wrapped in his oversized sweater. The sight made his heart twist. She looked so young and vulnerable. The lobby of the glass and steel tower was bustling with morning activity when they arrived. Nathaniel guided Veronica to a quiet corner near some potted plants, away from the main flow of traffic. "Stay right here," he instructed, handing her a granola bar from his bag. "I need to go upstairs for just a little while to finish something important. I'll be back as soon as I can." Veronica nodded, but her eyes were already wandering, taking in the impressive architecture and the steady stream of well-dressed professionals. As soon as Nathaniel disappeared into an elevator, her natural curiosity got the better of her. She stood up, drawn to the massive abstract painting that dominated one wall. The receptionist watched with interest as the young girl studied the artwork, her head tilted thoughtfully. "Do you like it?" the woman asked kindly. "It looks like a storm at sea," Veronica replied, surprising the receptionist with her insightful observation. Her wandering feet soon carried her past the lobby security desk. The guard was busy helping a delivery person, and into the maze of corporate hallways. The sound of voices drew her to a glass-walled conference room where junior executives were having a morning meeting. She pushed the door open slightly, fascinated by their professional attire and the colorful charts on the screen. The presentation stopped abruptly as heads turned toward her. Veronica froze, then quickly backed away, leaving behind a room full of confused expressions and whispered questions about the mysterious girl in the oversized sweater. Finding a stairwell, she climbed to another floor, where the smell of coffee led her to a break room. An elderly janitor was emptying trash bins, and his kind face reminded her of a grandfather she'd never had. He noticed her looking at the vending machine and pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket. "Here you go, sweetheart," he said warmly. "You look like you could use a treat." Meanwhile, Nathaniel had rushed through his report, his thoughts constantly returning to Veronica. When he finally returned to the lobby, his heart nearly stopped. The corner where he'd left her was empty. Cold panic seized him as he scanned the area, drawing concerned looks from passing employees. "Excuse me," he asked the receptionist, trying to keep his voice steady. "Have you seen a young girl? She was wearing a gray sweater?" "Oh yes," the receptionist replied. "She was admiring the artwork earlier, but then she wandered off somewhere." Nathaniel's pulse quickened as he hurried to the elevators. He had to find her before noon, before the caseworker arrived, before anyone started asking questions he couldn't answer. As he moved through the building, calling her name in hushed tones, he could feel curious eyes following him. The morning was quickly spinning out of control, and time was running out. The late morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive floor, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Nathaniel's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he searched frantically for Veronica, his collar damp with nervous sweat. Finally, through a glass partition, he spotted a familiar, oversized gray sweater. Relief flooded through him as he saw Veronica's small figure peering into one of the conference rooms. "Veronica," he whispered urgently, rushing toward her. Just as he bent down to speak, the distinct sound of elevator doors sliding open caught his attention. The atmosphere in the corridor instantly changed. Cora Hartwell stepped out, her presence commanding immediate attention. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, her silver-streaked dark hair swept into an elegant updo. Every employee in sight straightened their postures, their faces masks of careful respect. Even the air seemed to still at her arrival. Nathaniel felt Veronica stiffen beside him. He glanced down to see her face had gone pale, her eyes wide and fixed on the CEO. Before he could guide her away, Veronica's small hand gripped his sleeve. "That's my mom," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Nathaniel's mind refused to process the words. "What?" he asked, certain he had misheard. "No, Veronica, that's Ms. Hartwell. She's the CEO of—" "That's my mom," Veronica repeated, her voice stronger now, filled with unmistakable certainty. Her eyes never left Cora's figure. Cora Hartwell paused in her stride, her attention drawn to the unusual sight of a child in the executive wing. Her perfectly composed features showed a flicker of curiosity as she noticed Veronica. She gave a polite, slightly puzzled nod, the kind adults often give to children in professional settings. Yet something in her expression shifted, a momentary crack in her carefully maintained facade, so brief it might have been imagined. As Cora disappeared into a nearby meeting room, Nathaniel guided Veronica to a quiet corner near a potted plant. His mind raced, trying to make sense of her claim. "Veronica," he said gently, kneeling to meet her eyes, "I know you think that's your mother, but Ms. Hartwell is—" "I know it's her," Veronica interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "She looks different now. Her hair is different, but it's her." Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts scattered like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. The composed, powerful CEO he glimpsed in company meetings and the mother Veronica spoke of seemed like two entirely different people. Yet the certainty in Veronica's eyes was unshakable. Just as he decided to escort her downstairs, away from this increasingly complicated situation, quick footsteps approached. A junior assistant, looking slightly nervous, cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller," the assistant said, clutching a tablet to his chest. "Ms. Hartwell would like to see you in her office." He glanced uncertainly at Veronica before adding, "Right away, sir." Fear coiled in Nathaniel's stomach like a cold wire. The morning that had started with a simple plan to help a homeless girl had somehow spiraled into something far more complex. He looked down at Veronica, who seemed both frightened and hopeful, then back at the assistant who was waiting expectantly. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as he realized there was no easy way out of this situation. Whatever truth lay behind Veronica's claim, it was about to come to light in Cora Hartwell's office. Nathaniel's heart thundered in his chest as he entered the small conference room. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow on the sleek glass table where Cora Hartwell sat reviewing documents. Her silver-streaked hair caught the light, creating an almost ethereal effect around her composed features. She looked up as he entered, her keen eyes taking in his disheveled appearance. Nathaniel's fingers fumbled with his tie, trying to straighten it, but only managing to make it more crooked. His shirt, he realized with dismay, was wrinkled from his frantic search for Veronica earlier. "Ms. Hartwell," he began, his voice catching, "I apologize for any disruption." She held up a perfectly manicured hand, cutting off his nervous rambling. "Please sit down, Mr. Miller." Her voice was calm, carrying an undertone of curiosity rather than the stern reproach he'd expected. Nathaniel lowered himself into the chair across from her, his palms damp against his wrinkled slacks. "I can explain about the young girl," he said, words tumbling out. "There was a scheduling conflict with social services. I couldn't leave her alone in the cold, and I thought, well, I didn't think it would cause any trouble if she just stayed quiet in the lobby for a few hours." Cora's expression remained neutral, but her eyes softened slightly. "Is everything all right, Mr. Miller?" she asked, setting aside her documents. "It's rather unusual to bring a child to the office, especially without prior authorization." In the corridor outside, Veronica perched on the edge of a leather chair, her worn sneakers barely touching the polished floor. A young assistant with kind eyes had brought her a steaming cup of hot chocolate, complete with tiny marshmallows floating on top. The sweet aroma reminded her of winter mornings long ago, of breakfast in a warm kitchen with her mother. Her fingers worried at the frayed straps of her backpack as she strained to hear the muffled voices from behind the heavy door. The elegant surroundings made her feel small and out of place, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Through the door's thick wood, she caught fragments of Cora's voice, the familiar way she emphasized certain words, the slight lilt at the end of her sentences. It was different from her memories, more polished perhaps, but underneath lay the same voice that had once read her bedtime stories. A wave of longing washed over Veronica, so strong it made her chest ache. She wrapped her arms around herself, the oversized sweater Nathaniel had given her providing little comfort against the emotional chill. Inside the conference room, Cora leaned back in her chair, regarding Nathaniel with measured interest. "I appreciate your honesty about the situation, Mr. Miller," she said. "While I understand your intentions were good, you must realize that bringing unauthorized visitors into the building creates potential liability issues." "Yes, of course," Nathaniel nodded quickly. "It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Cora replied, her tone gentle but firm. "Personal matters should remain separate from our professional environment. You may go." Nathaniel rose on shaky legs, relief flooding through him. As he reached the door, Cora's voice stopped him. "Mr. Miller?" He turned, holding his breath. "Your compassion is admirable," she said softly. "Just be more mindful of company protocol in the future." Nathaniel stepped into the corridor, his heart still racing. Veronica looked up at him, hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. "We need to leave now," he said quietly. "The caseworker is expecting us." As they walked toward the elevator, Cora appeared in the doorway of the conference room. She watched their retreating figures, her perfectly composed features betraying a hint of thoughtfulness. Something about the girl's presence had stirred a long-buried memory, but she pushed the feeling aside, turning back to her waiting documents. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds of the government building's waiting room. Nathaniel and Veronica sat side by side on hard plastic chairs, their shoulders hunched with shared tension. The institutional smell of coffee and paper hung in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of cleaning supplies. Geneva Fields emerged from her office with a warm smile that did little to ease Veronica's rigid posture. The caseworker's sensible brown shoes clicked against the linoleum floor as she approached them. "I'm Ms. Fields," she said, extending her hand first to Nathaniel, then to Veronica. "Please come in." Veronica's small fingers clutched the hem of her borrowed sweater as they followed Ms. Fields into her office. Nathaniel noticed how the girl's steps grew slower, more hesitant with each foot forward. His own stomach churned with worry as they entered the cramped space. Ms. Fields settled behind her desk, surrounded by towering filing cabinets and motivational posters that had long since curled at the corners. She opened a fresh folder and clicked her pen. "Now," she began, her voice gentle but professional. "Mr. Miller, could you explain how you came to meet Veronica?" Nathaniel cleared his throat. "I found her outside my office building a few days ago. She was hungry and alone, His voice cracked slightly. I couldn't just walk away. As he recounted their meetings, the shared meals, and his growing concern, Veronica's eyes remained fixed on her lap. Each word seemed to push her further into herself, her shoulders drawing inward like a turtle retreating into its shell. Ms. Fields nodded, making careful notes. And Veronica, she turned her attention to the girl. Can you tell me about your mother? Veronica's fingers twisted in the fabric of her sweater. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. She used to sing to me, she said, avoiding eye contact. At bedtime, she had a special song about stars and dreams. Nathaniel watched as Veronica's eyes grew distant, lost in memory. She described fragments of her past life, warm kitchen smells, bedtime stories, a gentle hand smoothing her hair. But she carefully avoided any details that might identify Cora Hartwell, dancing around specifics with the careful precision of someone walking through a minefield. There was an accident, Veronica continued, her voice growing smaller. After that, everything changed. Ms. Fields leaned forward, her expression softening. And you have no other family? No aunts, uncles, or grandparents? Veronica shook her head, still not meeting anyone's eyes. In cases like this, Ms. Fields said carefully, we typically arrange temporary foster care while we investigate further options. Nathaniel felt his heart clench at the way Veronica's whole body tensed at those words. Before he could stop himself, he spoke up. What if? He paused, gathering his courage. What if she stayed with me? Just temporarily until you find a more permanent solution. Ms. Fields raised her eyebrows, studying him carefully. That's a significant responsibility, Mr. Miller. There would be background checks, home visits, paperwork. I understand, Nathaniel said firmly. I want to help. She trusts me and He glanced at Veronica, who was finally looking up, hope flickering in her eyes. I want to make sure she's safe. Ms. Fields tapped her pen against her desk thoughtfully. I'll need to review this request carefully. It's not a typical arrangement, but she offered a small smile. We can certainly explore the possibility. Veronica's shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time since entering the building, she lifted her head fully. Her eyes met Nathaniel's, filled with quiet gratitude and relief. The early morning light filtered through Nathaniel's worn curtains, casting a soft glow across his modest apartment. The gentle sizzle of eggs on the stovetop filled the small space as he prepared breakfast, stealing glances at Veronica. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her small frame hunched over an old copy of National Geographic. Her fingers traced the glossy pictures of far-off places while her borrowed sweater hung loosely around her shoulders. Almost ready, Nathaniel called softly, sliding scrambled eggs onto 2 chipped plates. I hope you like toast. Veronica nodded, carefully closing the magazine and placing it beside her. The morning felt delicate somehow, like a soap bubble that might burst at any moment. Neither of them spoke about the pending paperwork from Ms. Fields or what the coming days might bring. After breakfast, they headed downstairs, Nathaniel already worrying about leaving Veronica alone while he worked. The building's entrance hall smelled of pine cleaner and old carpet. As they approached the front door, a throat cleared behind them. Mr. Miller? The voice belonged to Leonard Drake, the building manager. His pressed shirt and clipboard projected an air of authority that made Veronica inch closer to Nathaniel's side. A moment, please. Drake's eyes fixed on Veronica, his thin lips pressed into a line. Several tenants have mentioned seeing an unfamiliar child coming and going. As building manager, I need to maintain security protocols. Nathaniel felt Veronica's small hand grip the edge of his jacket. She's a friend's daughter, he explained, keeping his voice steady. I'm helping out temporarily while her family sorts some things out. Drake's eyebrows rose skeptically. I see. And this arrangement is official? The paperwork is being processed, Nathaniel replied, not entirely lying. It's just for a short while. Drake tapped his pen against his clipboard, clearly unsatisfied. Well, Mr. Miller, I trust you understand that unauthorized residents, particularly minors, could create liability issues for the building. Of course, Nathaniel nodded, placing a protective hand on Veronica's shoulder. Everything will be properly documented. Drake held their gaze for a long moment before stepping aside. See that it is, he said, walking away with measured steps that echoed through the hall. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel stood outside Maria Sanchez's apartment, giving Veronica's hand a reassuring squeeze. The door opened to reveal a warm smile and the sound of children laughing inside. Come in, Maria welcomed them, the smell of fresh-baked cookies wafting into the hallway. Her two boys, aged 7 and 9, peeked around her legs curiously. Thank you for watching her, Nathaniel said gratefully. I won't be long. Maria waved away his thanks. No problem at all, the boys have been excited to meet her. She turned to Veronica with a gentle smile. Would you like to play with some blocks? The boys just got a new set. Veronica looked up at Nathaniel, who nodded encouragingly. The younger boy stepped forward, holding out a red block. We're building a castle, he announced proudly. Slowly, Veronica accepted the block and Nathaniel watched as she followed the boys to their play area. The tension in her shoulders began to ease as she carefully placed the block on their growing structure. She'll be fine, Maria assured him quietly. Go do what you need to do. Nathaniel nodded, his mind already turning to his next task. As he stepped outside, he pulled out his phone, determined to uncover the truth about Cora Hartwell's past and the connection Veronica claimed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as he began his search for answers. Nathaniel sat in the dimly lit archives room, surrounded by stacks of yellowed newspapers and microfiche reels. The musty smell of old paper filled his nostrils as he carefully turned each brittle page, scanning headlines and articles from years past. His fingers traced down columns of text, stopping at a small article that caught his eye. Business pioneer Cora Hartwell faces personal setback, the headline read. The article, though vague, mentioned a difficult family matter and custody disputes. Another clipping from months later hinted at a tragic disappearance, though details were scarce. Nathaniel's heart raced as he jotted down dates and names in his small notepad. Later that afternoon, back at the office, Nathaniel found Jonathan Clark in the break room. The older man was stirring cream into his coffee, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light. Nathaniel casually poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter. Been here a long time, haven't you, Jonathan? Nathaniel asked carefully. Jonathan nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. Going on 25 years now, seen a lot of changes. Including Ms. Hartwell's rise to CEO. Jonathan's stirring slowed. Indeed. Remarkable woman. Dedicated. He paused, choosing his words with care. Though dedication often comes at a price. What do you mean? Nathaniel pressed gently. Jonathan's eyes darted to the doorway before he spoke more quietly. Everyone has their reasons for throwing themselves into work. Some are running from something. He straightened his tie. Ms. Hartwell wasn't always the person you see today. There was a time... He trailed off, shaking his head. But it's not my place to discuss such things. That evening, Nathaniel's apartment was quiet, except for the soft clink of forks against plates as they ate dinner. Veronica pushed her peas around, her face pensive. How was work? She asked softly, not meeting his eyes. I did some research today, Nathaniel replied carefully. At the archives. Veronica's fork paused. About my mom? Yes. Would you like to tell me more about her? Veronica set her fork down, her small fingers fidgeting with her napkin. Her name was Cora, she whispered. I remember she used to sing to me at night, and she wore perfume that smelled like flowers. Nathaniel nodded encouragingly, his heart aching at the mixture of pain and hope in her voice. I'll help you figure this out, he promised. We'll find the truth together. Veronica looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and the first glimmer of real hope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cafe's worn tables as Nathaniel sat across from Geneva Fields. Steam rose from their untouched coffee cups, while the caseworker shuffled through her papers. The background check is standard procedure, Geneva explained, her voice gentle but professional. These things take time, Mr. Miller. We need to ensure everything is in order. Nathaniel nodded, trying to hide his worry. How long do you think it might take? A few weeks, possibly longer. Geneva adjusted her reading glasses. But Mr. Miller, we need to discuss something important. Have you considered what happens next? Temporary guardianship is just that. Temporary. The weight of her words settled heavily in Nathaniel's chest. Veronica's growing more comfortable each day. She's starting to trust me. That's precisely why we need to think about long-term solutions, Geneva replied. If we can't locate any family members. Back at the office, Nathaniel noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. The usual corporate hum was tinged with an undercurrent of tension. Cora Hartwell's elegant figure appeared more frequently in the hallways, her visits unscheduled and hushed. Staff members exchanged questioning glances when she passed. As Nathaniel rounded a corner, Charles Barrington's imposing frame blocked his path. The executive's eyes narrowed, studying Nathaniel with calculated intensity. "Miller," Barrington said, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "You've been busy lately." "Just doing my job, sir," Nathaniel replied evenly. "Are you?" Barrington's smile didn't reach his eyes. He brushed past Nathaniel, leaving a chill in his wake. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel spotted Cora Hartwell leaving a conference room alone. His heart hammering, he approached her carefully. "Ms. Hartwell, may I have a moment?" She paused, her perfectly manicured hands clutching a leather portfolio. "Yes, Mr. Miller?" "I wanted to discuss something hypothetical," Nathaniel began, choosing each word with care. "About family matters, specifically about a child who might have been part of your—" Cora's posture turned rigid, her face transforming into an icy mask. "Mr. Miller," she cut him off, her voice sharp as steel. "Whatever you think you're investigating, whatever game you're playing, stop. Now. Mind your place in this company." She turned on her heel, leaving Nathaniel standing alone in the hallway. But he had seen it, beneath her cold exterior, a flash of raw pain in her eyes. Not denial, not confusion. Pain. The late autumn wind rustled through bare branches as Nathaniel and Veronica walked through the park. Their footsteps crunched on scattered leaves, creating a gentle rhythm that matched their slow pace. This was where he had first seen her, alone and afraid. Now she walked beside him with growing confidence, though her small hand still gripped his jacket sleeve. "Tell me about what you remember," Nathaniel said softly, guiding them toward a wooden bench. Veronica's eyes grew distant, searching through memories. "She used to sing to me at night," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "A special song about stars and wishes. I can still hear it sometimes." They sat together, watching clouds drift overhead. Veronica's fingers traced invisible patterns on her worn jeans. "She had this beautiful necklace," she continued, brightening slightly. "Silver, with tiny flowers. She never took it off." Her smile faded. Until one day she did. Nathaniel listened intently, noting every detail. His heart ached at the mixture of love and loss in Veronica's voice. "The last thing she told me," Veronica swallowed hard. "She promised we'd find each other again if we ever got separated. She made me promise too." A gust of wind swept through the park, carrying dried leaves and swirling patterns around their feet. Nathaniel noticed Veronica shiver slightly and adjusted her borrowed scarf. "Look," Veronica suddenly pointed across the street. Through the antique shop's window, something sparkled in the afternoon light. Inside the cramped but cozy shop, they found themselves surrounded by treasures from the past. Behind the counter stood Harriet Wu, an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. "Can I help you?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. Veronica approached the display case, pressing her finger against the glass. "It looks just like Mama's necklace." Harriet Wu's expression changed as she studied the jewelry. "Oh, this piece. It reminds me of something similar from years ago. A young woman came in, She was crying, poor thing. Had to sell her necklace. Broke my heart to see it. Nathaniel felt his pulse quicken. Do you remember what she looked like? Elegant, even in distress, Harriet recalled. Such sad eyes. When Harriet offered to share a photograph of the original necklace, Veronica could barely contain her excitement. The black and white image showed delicate silver flowers linked in an intricate pattern. That's it, Veronica whispered. That's Mama's necklace. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on the photograph spread between Nathaniel and Veronica at the small table. Steam rose from Nathaniel's coffee cup as he studied the delicate silver flowers in the black and white image. See these tiny patterns here? Veronica traced the intricate design with her finger. Mama's necklace had the exact same swirls. Nathaniel nodded, remembering an article he'd read late one night about Cora Hartwell's rise to power. Before she became CEO, she'd struggled through poverty, working multiple jobs to survive. The article had mentioned her meteoric rise but glossed over the personal cost. Your mom, Cora, she might have sold this during a really hard time in her life, Nathaniel explained gently. Before she became successful, Veronica's eyes widened with understanding. When she was poor like us? Yes, Nathaniel said softly. Sometimes people have to make difficult choices to survive. Later that morning, Nathaniel found Jonathan Clark alone in the break room. His hands trembled slightly as he showed the older man the photograph. Have you ever seen Mrs. Hartwell wear something like this? Nathaniel kept his voice low. Jonathan's face paled as he studied the image. He glanced nervously at the door before speaking. She wore it every day when she first started here, he whispered. Beautiful piece. Then one day, it was gone. Never saw it again. He paused, running a hand through his gray hair. That was around the time everything changed. The company was growing fast, but Cora... His voice cracked. She lost so much personally. Those were dark days. That afternoon, Nathaniel slipped into an empty conference room, his phone pressed to his ear as Geneva Fields answered. I need to tell you something important, he began, explaining about Cora Hartwell and the mounting evidence. We think we've found Veronica's mother, and she's alive. Good Lord, Geneva breathed. Cora Hartwell? The CEO? Nathaniel, be very careful. This kind of revelation could have massive consequences. Through the glass walls, Nathaniel saw Charles Barrington pause in the hallway, watching him with narrowed eyes. Nathaniel turned away, his heart racing as he considered the weight of what they'd discovered. I understand, he told Geneva, but we need proof, something concrete that connects them. The fax machine hummed to life in the quiet corner of the office corridor. Nathaniel's hands shook slightly as he retrieved the paper, his eyes scanning the faded text. There, in official typewriter print, was the name that could change everything. Cora. He studied the document carefully. Most of it was difficult to read, with water damage making portions completely illegible. The mother's last name was a smudged mess, impossible to decipher, but that first name stood out clearly, like a beacon of truth. I've searched through 3 different county registries to find this, Geneva Fields had told him over the phone. It's not much, but it's something concrete. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel made his way to the executive floor, the birth certificate folded carefully in his jacket pocket. The carpeting here was thicker, the walls adorned with expensive artwork. As he rounded the corner, he saw Cora Hartwell entering her corner office, Charles Barrington close behind. Through the glass walls, Nathaniel observed their interaction. Charles's tall frame loomed over Cora's desk as he spoke, his expression cold and calculating. Cora's usual composed demeanor had cracked. Her shoulders were tense, her face drawn with worry. Whatever Charles was saying had clearly rattled her. Nathaniel quickly ducked behind a large potted palm as Charles emerged from the office. The executive's shoes clicked against the marble flooring as he passed by, pausing briefly to address a junior staffer. Remember where your loyalties lie, Charles said, his voice smooth but threatening. Some things are better left buried in the past. After Charles disappeared down the hallway, Nathaniel took a deep breath and approached Cora's office. She looked up as he entered, surprise flickering across her face. "Mr. Miller, what brings you here?" Nathaniel carefully placed the birth certificate on her desk. "I need to ask you about this." Cora's eyes fell to the document. The color drained from her face as she recognized what it was. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stop looking into this. You don't understand what's at stake." "But Veronica—" "I'm begging you," Cora cut him off, her professional facade crumbling. "Stop asking questions, just stop." The pain in her voice was raw and real. Nathaniel stood there, watching as this powerful woman seemed to shrink before him, years of buried grief evident in her eyes. Early morning sunlight filtered through the dusty kitchen window of Nathaniel's apartment. He sat across from Veronica at the small table, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, trying to find the right words. "I spoke with Cora Hartwell yesterday," he began gently. Veronica's eyes widened, her spoon pausing over her bowl of cereal. She told me something difficult. She said she had a daughter once, but..." Nathaniel's voice softened. "She believes her daughter died years ago." Tears welled up in Veronica's eyes, spilling onto her cheeks. "But I'm right here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm not dead. I'm right here." Nathaniel reached across the table, taking her small hand in his. "There must be some mistake, some misunderstanding. We'll figure this out together. I promise." Veronica nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. The moment hung between them, tender and raw, strengthening the bond they'd formed over these challenging days. That afternoon, the bell above Harriet Wu's antique shop door chimed as they entered. The shop owner smiled warmly, recognizing them from their previous visit. "I found something," Harriet said, pulling out a weathered leather ledger. She opened it carefully, pointing to an entry from years ago. "See here? The seller's name. It's faded, but you can make out E. Hardu before it becomes illegible." Veronica leaned close, her finger hovering over the page. Nathaniel watched her face as she processed this new piece of evidence. "I remember that day clearly," Harriet continued, her voice gentle. "The woman was so upset. She mentioned something about losing her family. It broke my heart to see her like that." Back at the apartment that evening, Nathaniel and Veronica sat at the kitchen table again, this time with a blank piece of paper before them. Together, they carefully composed a letter to Cora Hartwell. "Dear Ms. Hartwell," Nathaniel wrote while Veronica dictated. They included her memories, the lullaby she remembered, the way her mother used to brush her hair, small details that only a daughter would know. "We're not trying to cause trouble," Nathaniel added to the page. "We only want to meet with you, somewhere quiet, to talk about the truth." Veronica's hand trembled as she helped fold the letter into neat thirds. They slipped it into an envelope, and Nathaniel wrote Cora's name on the front. "Do you think she'll read it?" Veronica asked quietly. "I hope so," Nathaniel replied, setting the envelope aside for tomorrow's delivery. Sometimes people need a gentle reminder that truth comes with hope, not just pain. The next morning, Nathaniel's footsteps echoed in the empty corridor as he approached Cora Hartwell's office. His hand trembled slightly as he knelt down, sliding the envelope under her door. For a moment he stayed there, staring at the thin white edge that remained visible, before straightening up and walking briskly back to his desk. Throughout the morning, every elevator chime made him jump. His eyes darted to the doorway, expecting Cora's assistant or perhaps Cora herself. But no one came. The hours ticked by slowly, filled with the usual office sounds of typing and quiet conversations. Charles Barrington's presence felt particularly menacing that day. He stalked through the office like a predator, stopping at various desks, leafing through papers, and questioning staff members in hushed tones. His sharp eyes seemed to search for something specific, making everyone uncomfortable. When lunch break arrived, Nathaniel escaped to the small courtyard behind the building. The space was peaceful, with a few wooden benches surrounded by potted plants. He had just settled onto one of the benches when he heard familiar footsteps. "Nathaniel!" Veronica's voice rang out. She hurried toward him, followed by Maria Sanchez, who waved and quickly departed after ensuring Veronica was safely with him. "Hey there," Nathaniel said warmly, making space on the bench. He pulled out a sandwich from his lunch bag, breaking it in half to share. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Maria said we could surprise you," Veronica explained, accepting her portion. She kicked her feet slightly, watching fallen leaves dance across the concrete. "Did you give her the letter?" "First thing this morning," Nathaniel nodded, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Do you think she'll read it?" Veronica's voice was small but hopeful. "She will," Nathaniel assured her, watching more leaves scatter in the cool autumn breeze. Late that afternoon, the call Nathaniel had been waiting for finally came. His desk phone rang, and Cora's assistant's clipped voice instructed him to come to the CEO's office immediately. The walk to her office felt endless. When he entered, Cora sat behind her massive desk, looking both regal and vulnerable. The letter lay open before her, its crisp white paper stark against the dark wood. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice controlled but trembling slightly. "I need to tell you something." She paused, collecting herself. "Years ago, I had a daughter. She was taken from me. There was an accident later. At least, that's what I was told." Her composure cracked slightly. "They said she died." "Ms. Hartwell," Nathaniel started carefully. "Veronica could be—" "No!" Cora cut him off, tears welling in her eyes. "Please don't. I can't do this again." Her fingers curled around the letter. "You need to stop. Please just stop." Her voice broke on the last word. "But—" "You're dismissed, Mr. Miller," she said firmly, though tears now rolled down her cheeks. She clutched the letter tighter, as if it might disappear if she loosened her grip. The next morning dawned crisp and clear as Nathaniel Miller hurried up the worn stone steps of the city records office. Geneva Fields waited for him at the entrance, her usually neat appearance slightly disheveled from rushing to meet him early. "I called in some favors," she said without preamble, leading him through the maze of filing cabinets and dusty shelves. "We'll have access to the sealed records section for 1 hour." They worked methodically, pulling files and cross-referencing dates. Geneva's fingers moved swiftly through yellowed papers, while Nathaniel scanned endless columns of names. The musty smell of old documents filled their lungs as the minutes ticked by. "Wait," Geneva whispered suddenly, her hand freezing over a thick manila envelope. "Look at this." Nathaniel leaned closer. The file was marked with a red sealed stamp, but Geneva's special clearance allowed them to open it. Inside, they found court documents dating back 12 years. As they read, their eyes widened. The papers detailed a brutal custody battle. Cora Hartwell, young and struggling, fighting against a system that deemed her unfit to parent. The final judgment ordered a forced adoption arrangement, and there, in black and white, was the name they sought: baby girl Veronica Hartwell. Nathaniel's hands shook as he held the document. "This is it," he breathed. "This proves everything." Geneva nodded, her professional demeanor cracking slightly as she squeezed his arm. "We need to make copies of these immediately." The ancient copy machine hummed and clicked as they carefully duplicated each crucial page. Nathaniel's heart pounded with each sheet that emerged. Here, finally, was the truth that could change everything. "Be careful," Geneva warned as she helped him organize the copies into a folder. "This kind of revelation, it can be overwhelming for everyone involved." Nathaniel nodded, clutching the folder to his chest as they left the records office. The morning sun seemed brighter somehow, as if illuminating a path forward that had been hidden for so long. The small cafe nestled near the old park was quiet that morning, with only a few patrons scattered at distant tables. Nathaniel Miller sat beside Veronica, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder as they waited. The girl's fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. When Cora Hartwell entered, the bell above the door chimed softly. She wore large, dark sunglasses and a simple beige coat that helped her blend into anonymity. For a moment, she stood frozen in the doorway, her composure wavering as she spotted Veronica at the corner table. Veronica's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. Nathaniel gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze of encouragement. Cora moved slowly toward them, each step seeming to require tremendous effort. When she finally reached their table, she removed her sunglasses with trembling hands, revealing eyes already brimming with tears. She lowered herself into the chair across from Veronica, their gazes locked in an intense moment of recognition. "Veronica," Cora whispered, her voice breaking on the name. She reached across the table with shaking fingers. Veronica stared at her mother's outstretched hand for a long moment, before slowly extending her own. When their fingers touched, both of them began to cry softly. The tears rolled down their cheeks as years of loss and longing crashed over them. They sat in silence for several minutes, holding hands across the table, neither able to find words through their emotions. Other cafe patrons tactfully averted their eyes from this private moment of reunion. When Cora finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "I never stopped loving you," she said. "They told me you were gone. They said there had been an accident." She pressed her free hand to her mouth, struggling to continue. "I fought so hard to keep you," Cora went on, her words coming in broken whispers. "But they said I wasn't fit to be a mother. I was young, struggling. And then, when they told me you had died," she drew a shuddering breath. "I buried myself in work. I built walls around my heart. I couldn't bear to feel that pain." Veronica listened intently, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed her mother's story. Her small hand tightened around Cora's as understanding dawned in her eyes. They had both been victims of a cruel deception. Nathaniel watched them carefully, his heart full at witnessing their reunion. But his joy was tempered by worry as he thought of Charles Barrington and what the vindictive executive might do to protect his power over Cora. Outside the cafe across the street, Charles Barrington sat in his sleek black car, scowling through tinted windows at the scene unfolding inside. He held his phone to his ear, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Handle this," he snapped into the phone. "We need to contain this situation before she gains the upper hand." Inside the cafe, Cora reached out with her other hand to fully clasp Veronica's. "I promise you," she said firmly, despite her tears. "I will make this right." "We'll help you both," Nathaniel added quietly. "Whatever it takes." The morning sun filtered through Nathaniel's worn curtains, casting a gentle glow across his modest living room. Cora Hartwell sat perched awkwardly on his threadbare couch, looking out of place in her designer outfit. Veronica nestled close to her, unwilling to let go of her mother's arm, as if afraid Cora might disappear again. "I've kept everything," Nathaniel said softly, laying out the collected items on his coffee table. "Every piece of evidence we found." Cora's hands trembled as she picked up the photograph of the silver necklace. "I remember the day I had to sell this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I was desperate, alone." Veronica pressed closer to her mother. "I remember you wearing it," she said quietly. "It had a little heart charm." Cora's eyes filled with tears. She set down the photograph and picked up the partially damaged birth certificate, her fingers tracing her own name written there. The weight of lost years hung heavy in the room. "I want to make this right," Cora said, her corporate confidence stripped away, leaving only a mother's raw vulnerability. "But Charles, he has so much power in the company. He's been controlling everything for so long." A gentle knock at the door made them all jump. Geneva Fields entered, carrying her worn leather briefcase, her kind eyes taking in the scene before her. She settled into the room's only armchair, pulling out official documents. "Mrs. Hartwell," Geneva began gently, "would you like to explain what happened?" Cora drew a deep breath, her grip tightening on Veronica's hand. 20 years ago, I was young, struggling to build my career. During the custody battle, they said I was unfit." Her voice cracked. "Then they told me there had been an accident, that Veronica was gone. I believed them. I believed them for so long." Geneva nodded sympathetically, making careful notes. "I can help expedite the guardianship paperwork," she said, looking between Nathaniel and Cora. "Mr. Miller can maintain temporary custody while you work out a more permanent arrangement." Veronica's face brightened. "So I can stay with Nathaniel and see my mom?" "Yes," Geneva confirmed with a warm smile. "We'll make sure everything is legal and proper." Miles away, in his corner office overlooking the city, Charles Barrington stood like a statue against the floor-to-ceiling windows. His reflection showed a cold smile as a nervous intern handed him a thick file. "Interesting," he murmured, flipping through pages of surveillance notes. He picked up his phone, dialing a familiar number. "Jack?" "Yes, it's about Cora Hartwell. I'm concerned about her recent behavior. Very concerned. Her judgment seemed compromised." He paused, letting his words sink in. "As a board member, I thought you should know. The company's stability could be at risk." The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Cora Hartwell's penthouse, casting long shadows across the pristine hardwood floors. Cora's heels clicked against the surface as she paced, her usually composed demeanor fractured by worry. Her fingers brushed against the sleek leather sofa, but she couldn't bring herself to sit. Spread across her modern glass coffee table lay the remnants of a life she'd tried to forget. Yellowed photographs showing a younger version of herself holding a baby Veronica. Tear-stained letters she'd written but never sent. And a worn album she'd kept hidden in her private safe for decades. She paused by the window, staring at the city sprawling below. The corporate tower where she'd built her empire stood prominently in the skyline. That same empire now felt like a gilded cage, with Charles Barrington holding the key. Cora picked up a photograph of baby Veronica, her thumb tracing the infant's smile. "I can't hide you again," she whispered to the image. "Not when I've just found you." Her phone buzzed with messages from board members, subtle inquiries about her well-being, thinly veiled concerns about her recent behavior. She knew Charles was already planting seeds of doubt. The thought of the impending media circus made her stomach churn. Headlines would be merciless, questioning her competence, her maternal abilities, her right to lead. But as she looked at another photograph, this one of Veronica at age 3 playing in a park, Cora felt her resolve strengthen. She had lost her daughter once to silence and fear. She wouldn't let it happen again, no matter the cost to her carefully constructed public image. She gathered the photographs and letters, arranging them carefully in chronological order. Each piece told part of their story, a story she would need to share. The truth about how her daughter was taken from her, how she was deceived about Veronica's death, how she buried her grief in building her company. "I owe you this," Cora said softly to Veronica's image. "I owe us both the truth." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone to call her PR team. Before she could dial, she caught her reflection in the window. Impeccably dressed, perfectly groomed, the very image of corporate success. But in her eyes, she saw something different now, the fierce determination of a mother ready to fight for her child. The early morning air was crisp and biting as Nathaniel Miller stood outside the towering glass building. His breath formed small clouds in the cold, and his hands were buried deep in his coat pockets to keep warm. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few early commuters hurrying past with coffee cups clutched in their hands. At precisely 6:45 a.m., a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Cora Hartwell stepped out, her usual commanding presence somewhat softened by the weight of what lay ahead. Behind her, Sarah Chen, her most trusted assistant of 15 years, followed with an armful of folders and a concerned expression etched on her face. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Cora said quietly, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Is Veronica?" "Safe with Maria Sanchez," Nathaniel assured her. "The boys are keeping her occupied with breakfast and cartoons. She wanted me to tell you she believes in you." Cora's composed facade cracked slightly at these words, but she quickly gathered herself. Sarah Chen shifted nervously beside her, glancing at her watch. "Ms. Hartwell, the board members are already arriving on the top floor," Sarah murmured. "Mr. Barrington was here an hour ago, preparing." Nathaniel watched as Cora straightened her spine, adjusting her blazer with practiced precision. The morning sun caught the silver threads in her dark hair, and for a moment, he saw what Veronica must have seen in the old photographs. A woman of remarkable strength, even in vulnerability. "I won't let him control this narrative anymore," Cora said firmly. "Not when I've finally found her." Nathaniel nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was about to face. "I'll be nearby if you need anything," he offered, knowing his position in the company was modest, but wanting to show his support. Cora gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. For everything." She turned to Sarah. "Shall we?" Together, they walked through the revolving doors, their footsteps echoing in the marble lobby. Nathaniel watched them disappear into the executive elevator, his heart heavy with hope and worry. He thought of Veronica, probably sitting at Maria's kitchen table right now, waiting to hear how her mother would fight for their future. The sun continued to rise over the city, painting the building's windows in shades of gold and amber. Inside, the battle for truth was about to begin. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the empty corridor as Charles Barrington cornered Cora Hartwell. His tall frame cast a menacing shadow against the cream-colored wall, and his perfectly pressed suit seemed to amplify his intimidating presence. "That was quite a performance in there, Cora," he sneered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Playing the lost mother card? How desperate you've become." Cora's shoulders tensed, but she held her ground. Her fingers gripped the leather portfolio she was holding until her knuckles turned white. "If you think you can simply waltz in and announce this long-lost daughter of yours," Charles continued, leaning closer, "think of the headlines I could generate. CEO abandoned child for corporate success. Mother's negligence led to homeless daughter. The possibilities are endless." Cora's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "You've controlled this narrative long enough, Charles. You manipulated everything from the beginning." "Did I?" His smile was cold. "Or did you simply choose power over parenthood? The board might wonder about that. The shareholders certainly will." From around the corner, Nathaniel Miller stood frozen, his heart pounding as he overheard every word. He'd been on his way to deliver some documents when he'd stumbled upon this confrontation. "Leave Veronica out of this," Cora warned, her voice tight with controlled fury. "She's been through enough." Charles laughed softly. "Oh, Cora, you still don't understand. Everything is leverage. Everything." He straightened his tie with deliberate slowness. "Make your choice carefully. Your reputation, and hers, hangs in the balance." As Charles strode away, Cora sagged against the wall, closing her eyes briefly. Nathaniel waited until Charles's footsteps faded before hurrying outside the building. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and dialed Geneva Field's number. "Geneva? We have a problem," he said as soon as she answered. He explained Charles's threats, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk. "He's threatening to twist everything if Cora goes public." Geneva's voice was grave on the other end. "This complicates things significantly. If he launches a smear campaign, it could affect custody arrangements, public perception, everything. We need to move quickly but carefully." "What should we do?" "A press conference might be our best option," Geneva suggested. "If Cora controls the narrative from the start, presents the truth with dignity and documentation, it could neutralize his threats. But," she paused, "Veronica's emotional well-being has to be our primary concern. How is she handling all this?" Later that evening, Nathaniel's small apartment felt even more cramped with the weight of their concerns. Cora sat perched on the edge of his worn sofa, her usual confidence wavering. Veronica sat cross-legged on the floor, absently stroking the frayed edge of the carpet. "I don't care what people say about us," Veronica said softly, breaking the heavy silence. "I just want—" Her voice caught. "I just want you to be my mom. For real." Cora's hands twisted in her lap. "Sweetheart, it's not that simple. If Charles follows through with his threats, the media attention could be overwhelming. You'd be scrutinized, questioned. Your privacy would vanish." "But we'd be together," Veronica insisted, looking up with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. Nathaniel watched from his kitchen doorway, his heart aching as he saw Cora's hesitation and the flicker of hurt crossing Veronica's face. The bond between mother and daughter, so recently rediscovered, seemed to tremble like a delicate thread in the growing silence. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of the small rented meeting room, casting striped shadows across the worn conference table. Geneva Fields spread out several documents, her practiced hands arranging them in precise order. Across from her, Cora Hartwell sat rigidly in her chair, her usual corporate confidence replaced by visible tension. Veronica perched between Nathaniel and Cora, her small fingers fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweater. The room felt stuffy despite its size, weighted with unspoken emotions and mounting pressure. "These documents," Geneva explained, tapping a stack of papers with her pen, "will restore your parental rights, Cora. Once signed and filed, they'll legally establish Veronica as your daughter." She paused, making eye contact with everyone around the table. "But the public acknowledgement is crucial. Without it, Charles Barrington could challenge the authenticity of these proceedings." Cora's perfectly manicured nails drummed against the table's surface. "The timing. It's complicated. The board meeting tomorrow, the shareholders' concerns." Her voice trailed off as she glanced at Veronica, who had gone very still. "Mrs. Hartwell," Geneva's tone was gentle but firm, "I understand the corporate implications, but delay carries its own risks. Veronica needs stability, legal protection, and most importantly, certainty about her place in your life." Nathaniel watched as Cora's shoulders tensed further. He could see the battle playing out across her face. The corporate leader versus the mother, each role demanding different priorities. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel walked with Veronica through the nearby park. Autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet as they followed the winding path. Veronica kicked at small pebbles, her earlier quietness finally breaking. "She doesn't want me, does she?" Veronica's voice was barely above a whisper. "Not really." Nathaniel stopped walking, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "That's not true. Your mother loves you very much. She's just fighting against some very scary things right now." "But why can't she just say it?" Veronica's eyes welled with tears. "Why can't she just tell everyone I'm her daughter? Is she ashamed of me?" "No, sweetheart, never that." Nathaniel pulled her into a gentle hug. "Sometimes love has to fight against fear, and your mother has been afraid for a very long time." The evening brought no relief to the mounting tension. Cora arrived at Nathaniel's apartment looking exhausted, her designer suit slightly rumpled from a long day of meetings. Veronica sat on the worn sofa, clutching a small stuffed elephant Nathaniel had bought her earlier that week. "Veronica," Cora began, her voice taking on the same tone she used in board meetings, "you have to understand that timing is crucial in situations like this. Public perception, market stability. These things affect everyone in the company." Veronica's fingers tightened around the stuffed elephant, her eyes lowered to the floor, shoulders slumping visibly. The little girl who had been so full of hope that morning seemed to shrink into herself. "I just want," Veronica's voice quavered, "I just want you to say it, just once, that I'm your daughter." Cora's breath caught. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in their honesty. But Cora remained frozen, corporate fears and maternal instincts warring in her expression. Nathaniel stood in his small kitchen doorway, watching helplessly as Veronica's hope visibly dimmed. The distance between mother and daughter seemed to grow wider with each passing second of silence, filled with words left unspoken and embraces left ungiven. The midnight hour cast long shadows in Nathaniel's modest apartment. Veronica lay curled in her temporary bed, unable to find sleep. Through the thin walls, hushed voices drifted from the kitchen, drawing her attention despite herself. "The board expects stability," Cora's voice trembled slightly. "If this comes out wrong, everything I've built could crumble. Maybe we could handle this more discreetly." "Cora," Nathaniel's tone was gentle but firm. "This isn't about corporate image. This is about your daughter, who needs to know she matters more than any business legacy." "You don't understand the pressure," Cora whispered. "The scrutiny, the shareholders, Charles's threats." In her bed, Veronica pulled her knees closer to her chest, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. Each word felt like a knife twisting in her heart, confirming her deepest fears. Her mother cared more about her company than her own child. As the first hints of dawn crept through the window, Veronica slipped out from under her covers. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold floor as she found a scrap of paper and a pencil. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote 5 simple words. "Maybe you'll be happier without me." She placed the note carefully on the kitchen table where she knew they would find it. Her old backpack, still torn and worn, held what little she owned. With trembling fingers, she eased the apartment door open and stepped into the hallway. Each step down the corridor felt heavier than the last. Outside, a fine drizzle had begun to fall. The streetlights cast golden reflections on the wet pavement, creating halos in the pre-dawn darkness. Veronica pulled her thin jacket closer and started walking, each step taking her further from the only people who had shown her kindness since her mother's supposed death. But kindness, she had learned, wasn't the same as love. The morning light had barely strengthened when Nathaniel stirred from his uncomfortable position on the couch. His first thought was of Veronica, but the apartment's silence felt wrong. He found the note on the kitchen table and his heart stopped. "Cora!" His voice cracked with panic. "Cora, wake up!" Cora emerged from the guest room, still wearing yesterday's rumpled clothes. Her face went pale as she read the note, realization dawning in her eyes. "No," she whispered, the paper trembling in her hands. "No. No. No." Nathaniel was already pulling on his jacket, his movements frantic. "We have to find her. She's out there alone." Cora stood frozen, tears spilling down her cheeks, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely. The weight of her choices crashed down around her as she stared at the simple note in her shaking hands. Her daughter, the one she had thought dead for so many years, was gone again, this time because of her own fear and hesitation. The pre-dawn streets glistened with rain as Nathaniel Miller rushed through the emptiness, his voice hoarse from calling Veronica's name. Behind him, Cora Hartwell followed at a slower pace, her designer shoes splashing through puddles she would normally avoid. Her face was streaked with tears and mascara, all pretense of corporate composure abandoned. "Veronica!" Nathaniel's voice echoed off brick walls as he peered behind dumpsters and under store awnings. Each empty space sent a fresh wave of dread through his chest. He should have done more, pushed harder, made Cora understand that her daughter needed certainty, not careful corporate planning. "We should split up," Cora suggested, her voice rough with emotion. "Cover more ground." Nathaniel nodded and they parted ways. Cora traced paths from her past, places that held the weight of old memories. She found herself in the narrow alley behind the pawn shop where she'd once sold her silver necklace, desperate and alone. The park bench where she'd collapsed after losing custody still sat unchanged, though the paint had peeled away. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm so sorry, Veronica. I choose you this time. I choose love." Meanwhile, Nathaniel retraced the familiar route where he'd first encountered Veronica. The shabby park looked haunting in the pre-dawn gloom. He checked the corner where the kind street vendor often gave Veronica hot chocolate. Empty. Each passing minute wound the tension tighter in his chest. Near dawn, they met again at a deserted intersection. Cora's expensive suit was soaked through, and Nathaniel's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. The fear that Veronica might be hurt or lost hung heavy between them. "I was such a fool," Cora's voice cracked. "I let fear rule me again, just like before." Nathaniel squeezed her shoulder gently. "Stay strong. We'll find her." "We need help," he continued. "Maria Sanchez could check her neighborhood. Geneva Fields might have ideas. Even Jonathan Clark. He knows the city well." Cora nodded, wiping rain from her face. "Whatever it takes. I won't lose her again." Side by side, they stood in the drizzling rain, united in their determination to bring Veronica home. The morning sun barely pierced through gray clouds as Jonathan Clark and Maria Sanchez joined the search party. Geneva Fields worked the phones, methodically calling shelters across the city. Maria's young boys darted through neighborhood streets, asking anyone they met if they'd seen Veronica. In his darkened office, Charles Barrington studied reports from his hired investigator, tracking Cora's frantic movements through the city. His thin lips curved into a satisfied smile as he watched his plan unfold. The breakthrough came just after 8 a.m. A shelter volunteer called Geneva, describing a girl matching Veronica's description huddled beneath an old bandstand, the same park where Nathaniel had first found her. The news spread quickly through their network of searchers. Nathaniel and Cora rushed to the park with Jonathan and Maria close behind. Through the morning mist, they spotted Veronica's small form under the weathered structure. She sat with her knees pulled tight to her chest, her backpack beside her like a shield. Before they could reach her, Charles Barrington appeared with 2 burly security guards blocking Cora's path. His expensive suit seemed out of place in the shabby park. He held a thick folder of papers, waving them like weapons. "One more step, Cora, and these documents go public," Charles sneered. "Emails showing erratic behavior, psychological evaluations suggesting instability. All it takes is one press conference to destroy everything you've built." He smiled coldly. "Step down quietly and this all goes away." Cora trembled, but her voice rang clear across the damp morning air. "My daughter is alive!" she shouted, pointing toward Veronica. "This man exploited my grief for years, using my pain to control me. No more." Nathaniel stood tall beside her, holding up the sealed court records that proved Veronica's identity. Jonathan Clark stepped forward, his years of company loyalty evident in his firm stance. Maria Sanchez moved closer too, her maternal instincts blazing in defense of both mother and child. Several board members emerged from their cars at the park's edge, summoned by Jonathan's urgent calls. They watched in stunned silence as Charles's carefully constructed lies crumbled. His face reddened as he realized his leverage was slipping away. Cora broke free of the group, rushing to kneel beside Veronica. Tears flowed freely down her face as she finally publicly embraced her daughter. "You're my little girl," she sobbed, "and I'm never letting anyone separate us again." The gathering crowd, board members, neighbors, and curious onlookers, witnessed the reunion in respectful silence. Charles Barrington stood frozen, his folder of fabricated evidence hanging useless at his side. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corporate boardroom as Cora Hartwell stood before the assembled leadership team. Her posture was straight, her voice clear and unwavering as she shared her story. "For years I believed my daughter was dead," she began, her hands steady on the polished table. "That grief shaped every decision I made. But through an extraordinary series of events, and the courage of people who chose truth over power, I discovered my daughter is alive." The board members listened intently as Cora detailed Charles Barrington's manipulation and her journey to reclaim her family. When she finished, the vote to remove Charles was unanimous. Jonathan Clark, sitting near the head of the table, nodded in quiet satisfaction. "Our company will not be defined by deception," Cora continued. "I am stepping back temporarily to focus on rebuilding my relationship with my daughter. Jonathan Clark will oversee daily operations in my absence." Later that afternoon, Cora visited Nathaniel's apartment. Veronica sat close to her on the worn sofa, their hands clasped together. Nathaniel, still processing his unexpected promotion to senior management, prepared tea in the small kitchen. "We'll take it one day at a time," Cora said softly to Veronica. "I have so much to learn about being a mother again, but I promise I'll be here. Really here." Veronica's smile lit up her whole face. "I know you will," she replied, squeezing Cora's hand. As evening settled over the city, Geneva Fields arrived with a stack of documents. She spread them across Nathaniel's kitchen table, guardianship papers that would ensure Veronica's safety and stability. Cora signed each page without hesitation, supporting Nathaniel's role as Veronica's legal guardian. They celebrated with pizza, the cardboard boxes creating a casual contrast to the formal papers beneath them. Veronica laughed at a spot of sauce on Cora's designer blouse, and Cora joined in, no longer concerned with maintaining a perfect image. The warm glow of the streetlights outside painted soft shadows across their faces as they sat together, no longer 3 separate individuals, but a family bound by choice and love rather than just circumstance. The morning light filtered through freshly cleaned windows in Nathaniel Miller's apartment, highlighting the changes that had transformed the once sparse space. Where a simple cot once stood, A proper bed now graced Veronica's corner, adorned with cheerful yellow and blue linens that brightened the room. A new photograph hung prominently on the wall, capturing a moment of pure joy with Nathaniel, Veronica, and Cora beaming at the camera during a recent afternoon in the park. Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table with Veronica, helping her work through math problems. The familiar scratch of pencil on paper and their quiet discussion about fractions created a peaceful rhythm that felt wonderfully ordinary. Later that day, Cora arrived to take Veronica for their planned outing. The park that had once been a place of hiding and fear now welcomed them with dappled sunlight and gentle breezes. Cora reached into her bag and pulled out an ornate silver music box, its surface slightly tarnished but still beautiful. "I found this while going through some old things," Cora explained, carefully opening the lid. A delicate melody filled the air between them. Veronica's eyes widened with recognition. "I remember this song," she whispered, leaning closer. "You used to play it for me when I was little." They sat together on a wooden bench near the pond, their hands intertwined, watching ducks glide across the water. Cora's eyes glistened as she watched her daughter, overcome with thankfulness for this second chance. When they returned to Nathaniel's apartment that evening, Maria Sanchez appeared at the door with her children in tow, bearing a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies. The small apartment filled with chatter and laughter as the children shared stories from school, and the adults exchanged knowing smiles. Cora and Nathaniel stood near the kitchen counter, watching the scene unfold. Their eyes met briefly, acknowledging the precious gift they had all received, a family pieced together by choice and strengthened by love, surrounded by friends who had become an extension of their healing hearts. The apartment, once a symbol of Nathaniel's solitary life, now buzzed with the warm energy of connection and belonging. The sound of children's laughter mixed with the scent of fresh cookies created an atmosphere of home that none of them had expected to find, but all had helped create. A month after the family's reunion, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Nathaniel Miller's promotion meant he no longer worked late hours, allowing him to be home when Veronica returned from school. His apartment, once a symbol of his lonely existence, now held the warmth of family dinners and shared laughter. Cora Hartwell visited regularly, taking careful steps to rebuild her relationship with Veronica. She and Nathaniel found an easy balance in their roles. He provided the daily structure and guidance Veronica needed, while Cora offered both emotional support and ensured her daughter's future was secure. Their arrangement, though unconventional, worked because of their shared dedication to Veronica's happiness. In the quiet of a therapist's office, Cora sat with her hands clasped, finally giving voice to years of buried grief and guilt. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she spoke about the years lost, but also about the joy of rediscovery. The healing process was slow but steady, each session helping her become the mother she wanted to be. Across town, in a modest music school, Veronica's fingers moved carefully across piano keys. Her instructor, paid through Cora's quiet generosity, guided her through basic scales and simple melodies. The girl's face lit up with each new note mastered, finding joy in creating music. Evening brought them together in Nathaniel's kitchen, where savory aromas filled the air as he stirred a pot of homemade soup. Cora moved around him comfortably, setting plates and silverware on the table while Veronica chatted about her day at school. Their conversations flowed naturally now, free from the tension and fear that had once divided them. As twilight painted the sky in soft purples, Veronica sat at her small keyboard in the living room. Cora and Nathaniel gathered close as she began to play. Her fingers moved slowly but deliberately across the keys, picking out the familiar notes of the lullaby from Cora's music box. Though she stumbled occasionally, her determination shone through each measure. Cora's eyes filled with tears as she listened. The melody that had once brought only pain now carried hope in each note. Nathaniel's hand rested gently on her shoulder, a quiet reminder of how far they'd come together. When Veronica finished playing, her proud smile lit up the room as the final notes faded into the evening quiet. The community hall buzzed with gentle excitement on a bright Sunday afternoon. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the modest space where folding chairs formed neat rows before a small stage. An upright piano waited center stage, its polished surface gleaming. Veronica stood in a side room, smoothing her simple blue dress. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reviewed her sheet music one last time. The piece she'd chosen, the lullaby that had become so meaningful to her family, was ready after months of practice. The hall filled steadily with familiar faces. Maria Sanchez guided her children to their seats, their Sunday best reflecting their respect for the occasion. Jonathan Clark, looking relaxed away from the office, chatted quietly with several board members who had supported Cora through the recent changes. These executives, once stern corporate figures, now smiled warmly, transformed by witnessing the power of truth and reconciliation. In the front row, Nathaniel and Cora sat together, their shoulders nearly touching. Cora's eyes already glistened with tears of pride, while Nathaniel's calm presence anchored the moment. Their shared journey from strangers to family showed in their comfortable silence. When Veronica stepped onto the stage, the gentle murmur of conversation faded. Her small figure approached the piano with determined steps, though her hands shook slightly. She settled onto the bench and took a deep breath, her eyes finding Nathaniel and Cora in the front row. Nathaniel's encouraging smile and Cora's tearful grin gave her strength. The sunlight streaming through the windows cast a golden glow across the keys as Veronica began to play. The familiar melody filled the room, each note carrying the weight of their shared story. Loss transformed into love, fear into courage, loneliness into family. As the final notes faded, Veronica stood and gave a small bow. She descended the stage steps, and there were Cora and Nathaniel meeting her halfway. They came together naturally, Cora taking one of Veronica's hands, Nathaniel the other. They stood there, connected, their faces bright with joy and hope, their silhouettes bathed in the warm afternoon light streaming through the windows. If you enjoyed the story of Charles, Cora, and Nathaniel, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.